So I'm basically going to show two different strains of material. One will be fragments of a new video work that's part of an ongoing larger body of work. The first episode, which is showing in the gallery here. And I'm going to show you some images from a museum that opened 2 years ago in Bosnia. It is by means of a radical otherness that Western politics had already projected the idea of a civilized, peaceful Europe and its barbaric Balkan counterpart into its societies. It would cement these gaze through these same dividing logics when the United Nations signed one of its most controversial resolutions to date, formally establishing a UN safe area around Srebrenica, a small town located in eastern Bosnia. The events that took place there in July 1995, that culminated in genocide, continue to be of ample importance in Western societies today. In light of the many instances of violence and dreadful atrocities that took place in the world in the past decades after the genocide in Srebrenica, we must ask ourselves, why does the genocide in Srebrenica remain so important as a reference for us today? In the past 5 years, I've made a body of works which focus on the way in which the international community specifically has produced representations of the ethnic other during these wars in Yugoslavia in the 1990s. For several years, I have conducted research on the representation of the massacres that took place in and around Srebrenica. Within this, I focus on the Dutch government's decision to deploy troops to the safe area. In July 1995, the enclave Srebrenica was overrun. Men were separated from women in front of the Dutch blue helmets. 8,372 people were murdered. How did the people in Srebrenica arrive to us through the image? And how is that frame complicit to their disappearance? So let me repeat this because I think this is really important. How did the people in Srebrenica arrive to us through the image, and how is that frame complicit to their disappearance? Or as Judith Butler asks us, what is formed and framed through the technological grasp and circulation of the visual and discursive dimensions of war? How do we understand the frame as itself part of the materiality of war and the efficiency of its violence? One second, something closed on me. Ah, there it is. Ever since I started the work on Srebrenica, where I come from, my roots have been at the heart of questions, assumptions, and misunderstandings about who I am as an artist and as a speaking subject. A few days before the opening of this exhibition, this also became evident within the walls of the Van Abbe as an employee asked me, "How is your Dutch?" It always comes as a kind of shock, almost, when people ask me where I come from, only to realize that within my artistic practice, I do not and cannot identify as someone who, from the territories of the former Yugoslavia. It is as if they lose their hold on me, their way of making sense as to why I do work around the representation of Srebrenica. What am I still able or even allowed to say, if not coming from there, but from here instead? I've always been very clear about the fact that I speak from a Dutch white position, but the confusion around my identity has continued to grow throughout this exhibition, and people insist on knowing where my name originates, or in other words, knowing my ethnicity. As someone who believes that ethnicity did not produce these wars, but instead that it was the wars which produced ethnicity, this is an ironic problem. However, it's not strange that people want to know my ethnicity. looking at the persistent ways in which ethno-nationalist politicians in Yugoslavia activated the fictionalized sense of ethnic entitlement as a justification to ethnically cleanse whole geographical territories. I would argue that the former West has been deeply complicit in reducing the people who were subjected to these wars as participants engaged in an uncivil war identified now solely through their ethnic identities. It is for this reason, I think, that people desire for me to be a subject that belongs there with the others, because it allows them to separate ourselves from acknowledging that what happened there has something to do with us here. How does one proceed when one's agency is constantly muddled somehow, not easily acceptable to the eye of the museum, its employees, the media which covered it, and finally its public? What to do when one's own name does not allow for a register that is ironically an alterity to people's understanding of these wars, irreducible to a categorical ethnicity which belongs over there? For this talk, I have therefore chosen to use words from the exhibition announcement of the vanabbemuseum, which have appeared on their website and social media platforms as a framework to counter this understanding. 5 up-and-coming kunstenaars tonen intrigerende verhalen, veelal uit de landen waar hun wortels liggen. 5 up-and-coming artists which show intriguing stories from the countries where their roots lie. This talk will use the idea of roots to address that the ways in which we have perceived the people we were sent to protect has a national dimension, and that dimension is a Dutch one, stemming from a Dutch cultural archive and its racialized perception of Muslims. I will argue that if such is the case, then we must ask ourselves to what extent the actions and inactions from the Dutch military should be seen as a result of what Gloria Wekker has called the Dutch Cultural Archive, a Dutch protracted colonial archive. It is to ask ourselves what in the production of a gaze disappears, what body, what structure, what society allows the disappearance of a people. So I will start by showing you a few excerpts from the work that is currently on view here. Before the Fall There Was No Fall is the overall title of this work, and the first episode is called Raw Material. It is a research-based project which centers on a collection of roughly 100 Super VHS tapes that I first discovered in 2014. The tapes and their documents around it form the raw material for a new series of works I'm making. These tapes are kept in sealed archives of the Ministry of Defense in the Netherlands and contain the documentation of the military exercises of Dutch battalions. I started a process to negotiate their release in December 2014 through the Freedom of Information Act law, Wet Openbaarheid van Bestuur. The full collection of these tapes was finally released to me 4 years later. In order to prepare the battalions for their deployment, the Dutch military wrote role-playing scripts, which were intended to take into account everything that might occur during soldiers' deployment. The exercises were performed in NATO camps in Germany and Belgium and put the new battalions through intensive training to improve military skills. The training also produced an ideological framework, or a gaze, through which the soldiers were to view their relationships with both the people inside the territory they were sent to protect and the people outside the territory that threatened to overrun the enclave. For this, the Dutch military hired soldiers formerly deployed in Bosnia as actors. These soldiers turned actors were asked to pre-enact a script while also reenact an image of the people they had come across in Bosnia. Their experience would benefit new and inexperienced battalions and their understanding of Bosnian Serbs and Muslims. Students of a school for journalism in the Netherlands were asked to document these exercises on video while simultaneously performing the role of journalist. Now I will show you the first bunch of these fragments.
Chief? Where is Chief? Where is your Chief? Go get Chief. Go, sir. Chat Nathan, report. Where is your Chief? Man, where is your Chief? No, I don't know. Come. Oké, rustig man.
Hoe maakt het best een stukje terug gaan?
Hey, Simba. Kom weer dan.
Let's we go.
Laat hem even oplopen.
Ga je dat nog uit?
Laat hem even oplopen.
Ali! Yes, I go.
Alles bij.
You see, goed. Die vinden één grote breuk. Nekwervel.
Wat af. Simba, je hebt assistentie nodig.
Ja.
Hey, Simba, schema.
Yes.
Ja, kom op hier.
Yes, I'm coming. Alle. Oh. What's the leader around here?
Okay?
Leader? You speak English?
Spaanschland. She's on Spaanschland. Muslimanski. Allahu Akbar.
This is UN camp, you can't come in here. I told him, you can't come in here. No way.
Nee, maar
We are here for you.
We pray God for victory. We pray God for victory. We are the greatest warriors of the world. We are going to kill the Serbs. We are going to kill the Serbs.
The script provoked these role-playing soldiers to imagine the Muslims as macho, angry men. The male population is scripted as persistently bullying the UN soldiers, hiding weapons against the terms of the UN mandate, and engaging in black market activities. They are scripted as primitive and unclean of body.
Maybe good for you.
Maybe peanuts. Maybe. Nice good thing. 1,000 Deutschmark.
Maybe.
Yeah, good. Very good deal.
100 Deutschmark.
100, I smell.
That's only smell.
Yes, good, good. Very good.
Maybe this 200 Deutschmark. This could smoke. 300. This could
That's not good. It's letter.
well,
No, not good.
maybe matches.
What's this? Maybe book. Good book.
Nummer? Nummer Dasovic? Nummer Dasovic.
Name a good book. Name a good.
Maybe Patrona.
Muslim book. Muslim book. Muslim book, eh? Muslim book. Look, Muslim book.
Maybe Patrona.
In my first reading of the tapes, I found it remarkable that a scenario in which the UN safe area would be violently run over by Bosnian Serb forces was not included in the exercise. I was also astonished by the fact that there were no female actors included in the script, despite the fact that more than half of the population in the safe area is female, and women also actively participated in social and political life in Srebrenica, about, for example, food convoys and other political negotiations in the enclave. Dubravka Žarkov has insisted that the bodies of men and women were the very sites upon which the wars in Yugoslavia were fought. It is this lived as well as symbolic embodiment that enabled ethnicity to be produced. What is then the implications of a military exercise which leaves the presence of the female body within a territory outside of considerations completely, except as that of an objectified one? Women are marginalized through a process of militarization in which the natural position of men is privileged over the position of women, marginalizing women completely. The absence of the female actors during the exercise also fails to address the specificities of some of the violence occurring during the wars in Bosnia that were intrinsically gendered. Rape as a genocidal tool, but also sex slavery performed for UN soldiers. The people that the blue helmets were supposed to protect are scripted as Bosnian Muslim men who act out their sexuality onto an imaginary Oriental female body. By contrast, Bosnian Serb soldiers are impersonated predominantly as men who can be productively engaged with on the level of soldier to soldier or through gentlemen's agreements. I want to argue that the soldier's role-playing script is scripted with an ideological register in which the Bosnian Serbs are perceived as more white than the Bosnian Muslims, yet a whiteness that only functions to confirm the blue helmet's own superior masculinity as neutral yet fair-minded peacekeepers, capable of negotiation.
Wat ik gisteren afgesproken ben, dat was los waren met die moslims daar. En dan zie ik gezegd dat ze niks snel informeren voordat die actie moeten doen.
Ja, sag mal wieder, sag mal wieder. Ja, hier, Schwede, ja. Ruhig. Sag mal wieder. Das kommt schon, aber jetzt. Oh, ruhig.
Hier was wie gewohnte Mann. Der Police, die Police, Mafia.
Dat is denk ik wel niet zo wichtig. Gute Sachen, was ich kann, ist das gut. Zwischen das Bataillon, die Leute, die dort wohnen.
Sie sehen ja auch, dass, die muss wissen, sie sind nicht zu trauen. Jeder Mal sagen sie, ja, wir machen es, muss ich tun. Sie sind ja dabei.
Wir haben jetzt eine gute Relation.
Mit,
Wir zusammen.
Ja, wir zusammen, ja, freilich, und wir wollen Frieden. Das wissen Sie ja, wir wollen Frieden, aber die Muslimen wissen das nicht gut.
Ja, das ist immer auch, ja.
Aber in Holland auch viel Muslimanski.
Ja, in die große Städte.
Die andere Männer von der Post haben auch gesagt, mit Problem in Holland. Schule, es gibt Probleme.
Auch in Sprache. Es gibt eine Menge Leute erzählen, auch von mir bezogen. Und die Muslim, als man, sag mal, als man in die Welt sieht, kann man auch bei uns sehen.
Ja.
Und zum Beispiel, wenn man durch Amsterdam, das kennen Sie
Amsterdam, ja. Mit die Kiste. Walletjes, ja, die Walletjes.
Frauen.
Ihr weiß das. Hat ihr gehört von,
Ja,
Veel Leute, die hier de meisje,
Hollingen.
ja, der Junge hier.
Es gibt einige Jungs.
Ja,
die Witze, ja.
Aber das ist kein Problem.
Nicht,
Keine Frauen.
verkeerd.
Was heißt verkehrt?
Ja. Je bent twee mannen, dus. Und die Mannen, die Mannen, auch die Buche, die Buche ist, ja. Ja. Ja, Mannen immer, Buche,
En wie is dat die contacten in Srebrenica en Portugal? Wie is dat met die moslims? Wie is dat?
Es geht die Männer laufen, wie wir das nennen, die soziale Patrol.
Ja, in die gegend.
Die sprechen miteinander. Es geht besser. Es gibt eine Menge Probleme dort. Das können Sie sehen.
Aber Sie wissen, Sie sind nicht vertraut. Sie sind nicht vertraut, wissen Sie ja. Maar Sie sind nicht vertraut, wissen Sie ja.
Die Leute, die dort wohnen, sind vertraut.
Ja?
Ja, nichts. Das weiß ich nur.
Ja, nichts.
Ja, das geht. Of dat
Aber Sie machen nicht kaputt oder? Sie haben
Sie haben das einige Mal
versucht. Klauen. Ich sage, Sie sind nicht zu vertrauen. Das wissen Sie ja.
Wenn einer das macht, dann
Nicht
schon, dass die anderen.
Nicht einer. Sie haben selber gesagt. Wir müssen es selber versuchen. Wir müssen ein bisschen zu bezeugen, es ist zum Ende, Schluss. Und das machen wir zusammen. Ja, guck mal das. Ich glaube schon, wir kommen und wir machen das.
When looking at the 100 videos that are part of this archival body, the tragic realization is that the gaze of the Dutch soldiers has little to do with the people in the safe area Srebrenica, but is much more informed by an own inherent Islamophobia that developed gradually and exposed itself in specific manners in the 90s in the Netherlands. Furthermore, I believe that the soldiers' subjective experience of their own masculinity foregrounds their importance to the Dutch nation state, which is grounded in a masculinity of moderation and contemplation, which are supposedly inherently Dutch qualities.
You're gonna stay. Because when you are away, then the techniques.
Well, I know you are afraid, and we are very glad that we have a very good relationship with the people of Bihać, and also that we have a very good relationship with the military commanders here in this region. And well, as far as I'm concerned, for myself personally, well, I don't like going out of here because I like the city of Bihać and the surrounding here. And I didn't hear a word about a coming evacuation. So you must trust me.
You're gonna stay.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, I'm going to stay, yes. But you noticed the singing yesterday, or was it Monday? What day is it today? Wednesday. You heard the singing on yeah. You want some coffee?
Yes, please.
Mr. Mayor? You heard the singing 2 days ago? And you saw a very ugly man with a great beard walking around the compound? No? Well, that was Santa Claus. And Santa Claus brought us a lot of presents. And I want you to taste an original parquet leather. That's what it says here. And so that you going to get used at some original Dutch customs.
Next I want to show you some images from an exhibition which opened 2 years ago. There is a memorial museum next to the cemetery where at this moment about 6,500 people are interred. Next to the cemetery a museum opened and with a new exhibition. This exhibition was funded solely with money from the Dutch embassy. They put €1 million. The title of the exhibition is Srebrenica Genocide, the Failure of the International Community. To conceive of this exhibition, experts were hired from the Memorial Center of Westerbork, a former Dutch concentration camp, who in their turn also consulted with survivors and with Dutch pet soldiers to make evident, as they say it, what really happened in Srebrenica. The result of this exhibition is an at times bizarre reconstruction of the former compound on a paneled exhibition with more than 30 rooms. The first room focuses on the violent graffiti and drawings that were made by Dutch soldiers during their deployment. And amongst them is the sentence that became infamous through this poignant project, Bosnian Girl, of artist Celia Kamaric. So I'm going to, these are just pictures I made in the museum to give you a sense of how it looks like. The first room, it's I think 33 rooms, and the first room is solely dedicated to the very appearance of these graffitis made by Dutch soldiers. And there are some statements that are written by Westerbork about the content of this graffiti. Let's play. Sorry. And I will read you what it says on the panels as an explanation to the existence of this graffiti in the compound. Many of the people visiting the former compound are shocked by some of the content of the graffiti that they perceive to be sexist or racist. Many of the Dutch bed soldiers regret the graffiti were made. Sorry. Many of the Dutch bed soldiers regret that the graffiti were made. Sorry guys, for some reason. Okay, once more. Many of the Dutch soldiers regret that the graffiti were made, but also emphasize they were only meant for the small circle of military comrades. For a number of years following the departure of Dutch bed, the space of the former compound was under the control of the Bosnian Serb authorities, and some of the graffiti date from that period as well. They further go into these explaining these graffitis. Throughout the building and in many other locations, you will see the graffiti created during the missions in 94 and 5. They vary in style and content, which include simple names, calendars, signatures and copies of famous Dutch cartoons of the 90s. Mostly the graffiti were designed to decorate public and private spaces. I want to close with some excerpts of an essay that Dubravka Žarkov wrote about Srebrenica as a trauma in Dutch society. The discourse of the Srebrenica trauma, as constructed by the media, rests on an assumption of two interrelated, militarized masculinities, a classic heroic one and an ethical moderate one. This discourse on trauma has a specific function. It offers us the possibility for remedy and recovery. The media discourse on the Srebrenica trauma is produced in a complex social world of practices and power relations within one nation state and the competing meanings of its war history, its national and international politics, its self-image. The Srebrenica trauma is not just an expression in the Netherlands, it is a discourse in which masculinity, military and nation are linked in a very specific way. In that respect, the discourse on trauma may be thought to be one of the few acceptable means in which the powerlessness of one's own military men could be made public and tolerated by the nation. Dutch peacekeeping missions have been crucial for the formation of the national self-image, even in a society that imagines itself as the least militarized of all. The idea that a small country like the Netherlands is innocent of power politics that govern the foreign policies of great powers has over the last 150 years helped to shape the notion of the Dutch role in world politics. The Netherlands has prided itself on the specific way it managed its colonies, and in this discourse too, the virtues of a small nation were contrasted with large colonial powers like the UK and France. Gloria Wekker articulates this in similar terms in her book White Innocence. The construction of the European self and its others took place in the force fields of conquest, colonization, empire formation, permanent settlement by Europeans of other parts of the globe. She continued to argue that this entails the fundamental impossibility of being both European, constructed to mean being white and Christian, and being black, Muslim, migrant, or refugee. Persistently, an innocent, fragile, emancipated white Dutch self is constructed versus a guilty, uncivilized, barbaric one, which in the past decades has been symbolized mostly by the Islamic other. The establishment of the International Court in The Hague under the umbrella of a human rights discourse and the aesthetic appearance of the Dutch peacekeeper come into play in a contemporary Western Eurocentric discourse that aims to obscure its colonial history by presenting itself as an ethical peacekeeping nation. Fatima El-Tayeb also refers to this in her seminal essay, Oppressed Majority, Violence in Muslim Communities in Multicultural Europe. Since the early 1990s, two aspects of Western domination, US military force, and European human rights commitment is increasingly intersected. Humanitarian NATO interventions and succeeding international war crime tribunals suggest that waging war and protecting human rights are not only not exclusive, but in fact might need to go together. Especially since the enemy of freedom has moved from the socialist East back to a global South that has always been perceived as in the best case having nothing to offer to a global democracy and as actively trying to destroy it in the worst. Biro Herex-Hebby says that in the face of this, to speak about decoloniality in the post-socialist Balkan from a longer perspective is to rethink the post-genocidal present on our Roma and Muslim communities, not as outcomes of socialism, but as a historical formation of a European colonial race regime as a continuous project of violence, expulsion, and undesired race and religion bodies. This Reconquista strategies have sought to make the Balkans white again, contingent on and compliant with long-term Europeanization. A commitment to decoloniality requires a parallel undoing and unlearning of both post-socialist narratives of Europeanness, as well as the constant questioning of leftist narratives that erase questions of racism, homophobia, and transphobia in nostalgic renderings of the recent socialist past as colorblind and classless. Thank you.